Join the conversation at 1-800-765-8255. This is the Talk of the Town.
Texter in the show says 304 Talk 304. Hey, Dave, how can you go off script when it's anything goes? Good point. It's anything goes for you. I'll talk about anything you want to talk about, but you got to bring it up. I still come prepared. I still have a general idea of what I want to do. It's more of a guideline than a script. Please welcome to the show political science professor at Fairmont State University, friend of the show, Robert Bolton. Robert, good morning. Like I said, it's a loose outline. I don't know if I'd call it a script. Maybe I overstated the preparation for this show. How are you this morning?
Doing well, Dave, and for what it's worth, I always enjoy listening to your show.
I appreciate it. Last night, Vice President, now officially the Democratic candidate for president, Kamala Harris, it was her night on the main stage at the Democratic National Convention. What were your takeaways? What did you make of her much, much shorter speech than former President Trump? Only about, 37 minutes, 38 minutes last night. So it was, you could actually digest that speech last night, Robert.
Yeah, I was actually surprised at just how short it was when you compare it to some of the other speakers who appeared over the 4 nights of the DNC convention. Most notably, President Biden, his speech ran nearly an hour when I was watching it. I think it ended up tallying at just under 53 minutes. But overall, I thought it was a pretty good speech as far as Kamala Harris goes. She's no one's idea of a gifted orator, but she threw a lot of the red meat to the Democratic base, but also was doing like any good candidate will during a general election, reaching out to the moderate middle, which those independents and, somewhat more liberal Republicans and more conservative Democrats are going to be the ones who ultimately decide this election.
Yeah, I thought overall a positive tone. I didn't think it was I wouldn't have called it divisive. I thought for the moment it was good. And she does well, Robert, in these types of controlled environments. I know her critics will point out in the off-scripted moments is when she struggles, but in these types of moments, she's not Barack Obama as far as orators go, but I think she performs well in these types of controlled environments.
Yeah, overall, I mean, speaking bluntly, it's a little easier to read from a script than when you're, say, at a press conference or fielding questions from a reporter on the campaign trail. But on the whole, I thought she did pretty well. She mostly shied away from the divisive issues that can be weak points for the Democratic Party, especially in the Midwest. She did give a relatively full-throated support for Israel. Her conversation on abortion, which has generally been a pretty effective tool to rally the Democratic base, but which is something for the majority of Americans that are a little more uncomfortable with the topic. She only gave, 1 or 2 minutes lip service to that. And when it came to the Republican Party, although she did have some criticisms for the party writ large, she focused her attack not so much on the conservative or the Republicans or conservative ideology, but more so on Donald Trump himself.
Talking to Robert Bolton, he's a political science professor at Fairmont State University. And Robert, clearly she has some very bright, very smart people with this campaign. I think they have done a great job of portraying her as the challenger in this race, where she's the sitting vice president. If you dropped in from outer space, you would probably think Donald Trump is the sitting president based on the phrasing of the campaign, the way they have been able to put her, the way they've been able to control that narrative. I think they've done an excellent job with that, and that works to her advantage. Gives you a little bit of distance from the unpopularity of President Biden, but also allows you to be the new candidate. I know she's new in the presidential race, but she's been the vice president for 4 years. But you wouldn't know that based on the way they've been able to shape that, and I think that's been a very well-played strategy.
Absolutely. It's very interesting to me to see how the media narrative surrounding Kamala Harris has changed in the last few months. Before that first presidential debate with Joe Biden, if you had asked the average journalist or average political observer what they thought of Kamala Harris as vice president, they would have portrayed her and said that generally she's not very charismatic, she's extremely unpopular. There were multiple reports. I remember reading one in the New York Times a few years ago that talked about that her vice presidential staff really felt that they were adrift and she wasn't really able to set a good agenda. But you've seen a complete makeover in the last few months since Joe Biden's disastrous debate performance and ultimate bowing out of this campaign. Overall, yeah, I have to say that her handlers have did an extreme leader.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry about that. They did an effective job at portraying her as a potential new leader and standard bearer for the party.
So where does this race go from here? Vice President Harris has had a lot of momentum, has kind of had the tailwinds with her over the last month since becoming the presumptive nominee. How does this start to play out, or what are you looking for in the coming weeks?
Well, I expect starting today that the honeymoon period is over. I expected that would happen, and you're already starting to see some criticisms of her. With Joe Biden giving up the Democratic nomination and Kamala Harris being anointed at the convention, it in a lot of ways, according to the polls right now, has reset this race. Joe Biden was flagging in the poll numbers, and admittedly, we're still months away from the general election, but Kamala Harris is now running neck and neck with Donald Trump. I think that you will see a very close race from this point forward, and it'll be interesting to see what happens in those battleground states.
Talking to Robert Bolton, Fairmont State University political science professor. I didn't put this on the list when I was texting you this morning, but I am curious to get your thoughts about back here in West Virginia, the U.S. Senate race. Governor Justice's families, companies, their business struggles, well documented, Robert, especially over the last couple of weeks with the Greenbrier, the health insurance payments, the mortgage payments. Greenbrier may be going up for auction, but now that's averted with an agreement. Does all of that, to the average voter, will that have an impact? I'm sure we'll get some polling here in the next couple of weeks, but as you watch this race, is that enough to tip the scales and give Glenn Elliott some momentum?
No, absolutely not. Again, absent some health crisis or some very serious criminal allegation against Jim Justice, which neither of those I've got any indication of, I don't see it significantly changing this race. As I'm sure you're aware, Dave, I'm an attorney, and I sometimes deal with debt collectors on both sides of the issue. And this idea of putting up the Greenbrier for auction, that was really ultimately a negotiating tactic. I don't think anyone who's in the legal field or even in the debt collection field seriously contemplated that it would actually be sold at this point. Jim Justice, from every indication, does still have significant financial resources, even if his overall wealth has shrunk in recent years. And I just don't think that that's really going to matter to most voters because, again, when he was running for re-election as governor, some of these issues were already starting to bubble to the surface, and you saw that people did not really care much about it. Also, again, when you look at which party he's running under, if he had been the Democratic nominee this time, it might have been more of a concern, but I do not see this mattering significantly. Same thing with some of the other issues that are coming out right now. For example, the baby dog being painted on the mural at the West Virginia Capitol. By and large, most people may say, tut that, and not necessarily approve, but I don't think it's going to be nearly enough to convince them not to vote for him.
You know, I think there are a couple of things that I agree with you, Robert, for a couple of reasons. One, I don't know how much the average person who has to go to work and the kids have ball games, how much are they sitting around worried about if Jim Justice is paying his bills or not? I don't know. We're very involved into it because, well, I'm in this business. You're an attorney, political science professor. You're into that. We're not we're not the average voter. We don't have lives, Robert. These are our hobbies. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. This is how we make our bread, and you're absolutely right, Dave. And I do think it's one of those things where, again, it gives us something to talk about, but for the average voter, it may actually be something in some ways. If I was Jim Justice's campaign manager, you might even want to try and spin this in a positive manner and say, look, even the governor sometimes understands what it's like trying to make ends meet, maybe at a larger scale, but nonetheless, he has bills to pay like everyone else, and sometimes maybe struggles with that. And
you touched on this, and I'll put it a little bit more bluntly, given the political environment right now in West Virginia, Robert, you could run Baby Dog, and as long as Baby Dog was a Republican, I think she would get the votes. She would get the win. There are a lot of people, I think, who are going to vote and say, look, I'm not going to vote for a Democrat. So what? Jim Justice doesn't pay his bills. He's going to vote Republican if we send him to the Senate. I think a lot of people will go to the polls with that mindset. And that's not necessarily based on a whole heck of a lot other than a gut feeling. So all that to say, I agree with you, Robert.
Absolutely. The one last thing I'll say in regard to that is it's important to remember also this is a presidential election year, so you're going to see much higher voter turnout than you would in either a primary or in a midterm election. And when you have a general election, that's usually when your quote-unquote low information voters are going to get out there and cast their ballot. And there are going to be many people who are going to vote straight ticket in this election. Maybe they aren't going to press an actual straight ticket button because that's not an option anymore.
Right.
But as a practical matter, they'll go down the line voting for the Republican candidate.
Robert Bolton, Fairmont State University, political science professor. Always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for the perspective.
Always fun to be on, Dave. Take care now.
You as well. Coming up, it's Anything Goes Friday. I'll talk about anything you want to. Got a couple of texts to get to. We'll bring those to you. Connor is sitting over there just waiting for the phone to ring, highly anticipating something to do. Give him a little bit of work today. 304-TALK, 304 the text line, 800-765-8255 the phone number.